as a segue to pass the virtual mic to our experts and Professor Hank to start off with, and invite him to kind of share a little bit of his perspectives on where he sees, particularly the U.S. economy going, what has happened recently, and what might happen over the next few quarters. I think folks who follow at least the discussion on the economic side here in the U.S. know him pretty well. I don't think he needs any introduction.
I didn't like the way she treated me on this trip, right? And
I think I don't think I'll do justice to his resume as we get to his qualifications, talk about the subject, and we see him on CNBC, we see him on Wall Street Journal very, very often. So with that, I will pass the mic to Professor Hank. And Professor Hank, thank you so much for taking the time, and would love to get your thoughts on what you've seen happen in the markets and with the Fed recently, and how would you advise us to think about the next few quarters?
Okay, thank you, Gaurav. Let me just give a kind of a brief overview of my take on things. First of all, let me start by quoting Milton Friedman. Friedman, one of my old mentors, who's unfortunately no longer with us, once said, monetary policy is not about interest rates, it's about the rate of growth in the money supply. Now, you wouldn't know that from reading the press today, because everything is talking about what the Fed did yesterday with the increase in the federal funds rate by 25 basis points. But that gets to one thing that I think all of the people in the audience should get under their belt, and that's my 95% rule. 95% of what your financial press is either wrong or irrelevant. And that could even be a higher number now. I've used that 95% rule for years, but you got to be careful with what you're reading in the paper and what the wagging tongues are talking about. You also wouldn't know that monetary policy is not about interest rates, it's about changes in the money supply if you listen to Chairman Powell, because he and the Fed have now, ever since 2020, been doubling down, tripling down on the whole idea that there's no connection between changes in the money supply and changes in economic activity and changes in inflation. But let me remind you, it was the Fed that told us that the inflation we were experiencing in 2021-22 was temporary. And remember, supply chains were all the rage then, and a variety of temporary things. Now, and of course, they missed the inflation forecast completely. You really wonder what the 785 economists who work at the Federal Reserve actually do. But at any rate, they told us it was going to be temporary. It wasn't temporary. They also told us that inflation was global. No, inflation is always local. It's created by changes in the domestic money supply in whatever the country is that you happen to be living in. Right now, we have 6% inflation in the United States. It's come down from that peak month of 9.1%. It's falling pretty fast, actually, 6%. Canada, 5.2. How about China? China has the lowest inflation in the world, 1% year over year. Also another low one, Switzerland, 3.4% year over year. Japan, 4.3% year over year. You go to the UK and it pops up to 10.4%. Eurozone, 8.5%. So it's all over the place. It's not global, it's local, and it's created by changes in the money supply that are associated with local central banks. So the Fed, in my view, is clearly the gang that can't shoot straight. Really, at this point, I put them in the classification of incompetent more than anything else. So who got it right? Who got this inflation call right? And why did they get it right? Well, it happens that John Greenwood and I did get it right. We're one of the first ones to call in July of 2021. Actually, in February, we had an article February of 2021 in the Wall Street Journal where we said that inflation would jump up to 6 to 9%. And it did jump up to 9.1%. That was the most rapid year-over-year monthly rate we had. And now we are in the camp of saying that inflation is falling fast, and in fact will end this year in the 2 to 5% range. We just had a piece in the Wall Street Journal about a month and a half ago in which we put the numbers on that. So you have to ask the question, well, why have we been able to get things right? And we've gotten things right because we're looking at the money supply. We're looking at the thing the way Friedman looked at things, the quantity theory of money. It's all about changes in the money supply. And I've recently done a big study of 147 countries in the period 1990 to 2001, in which I looked at the annual rates of change in the money supply and the annual rates of change in inflation in these 147 countries. And bingo, surprise, the correlation coefficient between changes in the money supply and changes in prices is 0.94%, which is consistent, by the way, with other studies that have been done. So it's all about money. So how does this work? What's the transmission mechanism? The first step is you have to get sustained changes in the money supply. And then there are lags that occur. And the first lag is between changes in the money supply and changes in asset prices. That takes about 1 to 9 months. And when I say asset prices, that's obviously equities fall into that category. And also very sensitive commodity prices fall into that category. Then with a lag of about 6 to 18 months, you've got changes in real GDP. And then ultimately, with a long lag of about 12 to 24 months, you get changes in inflation. So the question is, well, where are we right now? Well, what we had, by the way, in 2020, 2022, what did we have? The money supply went up by 18% per year on average, 18% per year on average in the US, the highest rate of growth in the money supply over a sustained period of time we've ever had. And what did we get? We got inflation. Now we're seeing exactly the reverse. The Fed is throwing everything into reverse. And for the last 9 months, we've actually seen a contraction in the money supply of 2.3%, which is the biggest contraction we've had since 1936 in the United States. So you've got this kind of whipsaw effect going on, a huge increase, unprecedented in the money supply, and with a lag of about 12, 24 months, what did we have? We had quite a lot of inflation. Now they've thrown things completely into reverse, and we're seeing contractions in the money supply, and that's why Greenwood and I think the inflation story is basically over. I mean, it's winding down and winding down pretty fast. Now, the interesting thing about this is that I'm talking about changes in the money supply, but what's the Fed talking about? They're talking about changes in the interest rate. What are the newspapers talking about? Changes in the interest rate. What are CEOs and CFOs talking about? They're looking at changes in the interest rate. Those are pretty much irrelevant in terms of the course of the nominal GDP, which is composed of both a real component and inflation component. So we have, I think, a recession baked in the cake, given this contraction in the money supply. And everything is consistent with that. If you look at corporate profits peaked in the fourth quarter of 2022, commercial real estate is heavily in default. Bankruptcies filings are surging. Loan delinquencies are going up. All the leading indicators are negative. The yield curve is now extremely negative, which is usually consistent with a coming recession. So I think we're going to see a recession. And as I say, the inflation story is in a way over in the sense that with the lag of 12 to 24 months, inflation follows whatever is going on in the money supply, and the money supply has been crashing big time. Now, just one thing that's slightly relevant for you as businessmen is the fact that with the banking crisis, which, by the way, the Fed, where were the San Francisco Fed bank examiners looking at the Silicon Valley Bank? They were asleep at the wheel. If you look at the 10K filings the fourth quarter of last year, there were so many red flags in that thing. Any freshman taking a finance course could have spotted them. The Fed was asleep at the wheel. The bank goes down. We've got the bank problems, and those bank problems are important because already a big contributor that has been keeping the money supply from not contracting faster than it would otherwise contract is loan growth by banks. That has been slowing, by the way. The last 9 months, it's slowed from double digits. Now, if you look at the 6-month annualized growth rate in bank credit, it's down to about 3%. It was up as high as about 11%. That's a bad sign because it's going down, and the banks will hunker in even more. So I anticipate that will actually probably slide into negative territory, the loan growth, and that is a big contributor to the money supply. So if it goes negative, it's going to be dragging the money supply down even more rapidly than it's already contracting, which means that the recession will be deeper and it will last longer than would otherwise be the case. Plus the fact you'll be caught in a credit squeeze. You'll find that it's much more difficult to get credit in the coming months than it has been in the past. So I think with that, I will end and just wait for your questions.
Thank you, Professor Hank. Just a quick one from my side, Professor. Like, how do you think about the depth or the length of the recession? I mean, that's been a big point of debate around whether it's shallow, whether it's deep.
I think it'll be longer and deeper than most people think because the money supply contraction, as I said, is unprecedented. We have not seen this kind of contraction since 1936. So it's very unusual. And the Fed, if you listen to Powell yesterday, he says, we're increasing 25 basis points of federal funds rate, which is somewhat irrelevant. And he said, everything will remain steady as you go going forward after this last increase. The problem is they're engaged in quantitative tightening. That is reducing the size of the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve by letting the securities that they own mature and run off. And that is continuing to tighten. He didn't say anything about this. The quantitative tightening continues. And so the monetary squeeze is going to continue. And what's interesting is the Fed is flying blind. They are not looking at the money supply. They're not paying attention to the money supply. So that's why it's extremely dangerous in my view. The quantitative tightening, by the way, it's conceivable that if the monetary contraction and squeeze really creates a big liquidity crisis, or the banking crisis flares up more, the Fed could conceivably pivot rapidly and stop the quantitative tightening. But by then it's too late, because all these indicate they're looking at a lot of lagging indicators. They're not looking forward. That's why I say the recession is already baked in the cake. Now, whether it's deep or long depends on it. Do they keep the squeeze on? And so far, it looks like they're going to keep the squeeze on. So I would be in the long duration, deep recession mode. I'd be tilted that way.
Thank you, Professor. Folks, any other questions from your end?
Yeah, I'll jump in if you don't mind. It's Paul Wrights from Titan. Professor, question for you. So you talked about lagging indicators. To my knowledge, the Fed uses a very heavy lagging indicator and an archaic survey to understand the housing cost. And so that makes a big part of, to my knowledge, again, a big part of the inflationary index. So if they're ignoring the monetary impacts, like you just illustrated, they're using lagging indicators with housing, which makes up a big part of the component. What's our real inflation rate at, and what happens with them being so far off with truly understanding the inflationary rate and the impact of their decisions? And what the hell are those 400 PhDs doing at the Fed?
Well, the last question is they're collecting fat salaries and not coming up with very accurate forecasts. But as far as where the accurate inflation is, I'm not going to really get into that debate, because it's measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and let them have their number. That's what everybody looks at, and they look at, obviously the headline as well as the distribution of prices in that basket. But it is my point, and John Greenwood's point is, if you look at the money supply numbers, this headline rate that we're looking at is coming down pretty fast. And so I think the inflation story is, as I say, it's kind of over. Now, that's contrary, by the way, to the Fed, because the Fed switched from this narrative where they were talking about inflation being temporary. Remember team temporary? They were on team temporary. Then they switched all of a sudden, and they became team persistent. That the inflation was global. It was persistent. It was going to be hard to get rid of. We're going to keep fighting it. And even yesterday, Powell's still talking that talk. That's the narrative, is that we've got a big fight on our hands. And if you look at the Bank of England and the European Central Bank, they're talking exactly the same way. It's a big echo chamber, by the way. Those three central banks are a complete echo chamber. They're not, none of them looking at the money supply, by the way. None of them looking at the money supply. The Fed is data dependent and data driven. They're looking at high frequency data that comes out that, by the way, most of this stuff is very lagging. They're very focused on what's going on in the labor market. Well, the labor market's very lagging. You don't start firing people before a recession. You start firing after you get into trouble in the recession. That's the last thing you do, is want to let go of your help. It's not the first thing you do, it's the last thing you do. But that's what the Fed's looking at right now. They're very focused on the labor market, and the labor market looks pretty hot yet. And so they think the economy is hot, and inflation is persistent. And so they will keep quantitative tightening on. Maybe they will not increase federal funds anymore, but quantitative tightening, that's where the real teeth are that bite in the money supply, by the way. The interest rate connection with the money supply is very fuzzy and loose, but the quantitative tightening thing is extremely direct.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm trying to understand your money supply focus and comments a little bit more. So I might not be looking at the right thing. I went to the Fed website and looking at the M3 money supply, and in the 10-year period from 2010 to 2020, it grew about 6 trillion. And then in the last 2 years, with all the stimulus, federal stimulus from COVID and the quantitative easing, it grew another 6 trillion. So there's like a massive spike in the money supply in the last 2 years. So why wouldn't a contraction of that to kind of put us back on trend line be natural as opposed to something to worry about? I'm trying to understand all that.
Okay, well that's a good question. So the way to think about it roughly, and I've got the numbers in front of me. By the way, it's what you want to look at. The broadest measure they have is actually M2. So you're probably looking at M2, not M3, because they don't produce M3 anymore. They dropped that a few years back. But at any rate, here's how to think about it. So they had this huge explosion of the money supply, 2020 through 2022. It was growing at average rate of 18% per year. Now, here's the question. What would be the rate of growth in the money supply that would be consistent with hitting a 2% inflation target? And it works out, it's about 5 or 6%. So they were growing the money supply about 3 times faster than the rate of growth in the money supply given by the equation of exchange in that period of time. Now, that leads to an excess amount of money relative to where the trend should be, back to your trend. So you have this huge excess hanging over you. And yes, the economy is growing, they're contracting the money supply, and what's happened is that excess has almost all been burned out of the economy, and we're very close to being back to the trend already. And that's why, by the way, I think that all of the excess will be burned out by probably June. It'll be completely burned out. And when that occurs and you get back on the trend, what's the trend consistent with? It's consistent with a 2% inflation rate. And that's why by the end of the year, Greenwood and I are pretty confident that inflation will be between 2 and 5%. So your point, just to summarize, there was a big excess. You're right, and there is a long-term kind of trend, and the long-term kind of trend is pretty good, actually. It is about 5 or 6% growth, where it should be, but we've come back and we're hitting that pretty soon because this excess has been burned off. Does that help you?
Yes, thanks. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. By the way, let me. This is if you have a piece of paper and a pencil in front of you, you can. The equation of exchange, I alluded to that. That's an identity in economics, but that drives all the quantity theory of money and what I'm talking about. And the identity is MV, money times velocity V equals PY. P is the price level and Y is the real rate of growth in the economy. So if you rearrange that and differentiate it, the little algebra ends up into the change in the money supply. We're now going to calculate what I call the golden growth rate. That is a rate of growth consistent with hitting a 2% inflation target. And we're using the equation of exchange. So if you differentiate it, okay, and just copy this down. Change in the money supply, that's the golden growth rate we're trying to solve for, is equal to the change in the price level. And the change in the price level is 2%. That's the target. Plus the change in Y, the change in real economic activity. And the potential in the US is around 2%. It's a little over 2%, but it's about 2%. And then since we've taken the V over to the right, from the left-hand side of the identity to the right-hand side, we have a minus change in V, and V is the velocity, and that drops at about a negative 2% per year. So here's the way to think of the golden growth rate. 2%, that's the change, that's the price level target, plus 2% real rate of growth, plus 2% the velocity, the minus times a minus. We have a minus velocity, change in velocity, but velocity has a negative sign, so it's plus. So 2 plus 2 plus 2 equals 6. That's the golden growth rate. And it comes from the equation of exchange, MV equals PY. So it's very straightforward. And if you know what you're doing, you can use it as Greenwood and I did to come out with pretty accurate forecast for where the economy is going. That's monetarism in a nutshell. That's monetary economics and monetarism. But that's exactly what the Fed is canceled. I mean, Powell has actually testified before Congress over and over again, saying that the quantity theory of money is irrelevant. They're not looking at the quantity theory of money. They're data dependent. They're looking at high frequency data coming out every day, or quite frequently, not every day. And they're using what we call post-Keynesian macroeconomic models. And those post-Keynesian macroeconomic models, they don't include money. Money is not in a post-Keynesian model. Interest rates are, but money is not.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Hanke, for